Well, hello everyone. This is Dan Misla from Catholic Climate Covenant. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes to see if latecomers can get on, and then we'll begin our webinar. Thank you. Okay, there's still a few more people joining us, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon from the Catholic Climate Covenant headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to our webinar, Why the Faith Community Holds the Climate Key. I'm Dan Misla, Founding Executive Director of Catholic Climate Covenant, and I'm grateful for all those who are able to join us today and hope that this webinar will be useful for all who wish to understand how the faith community generally and the Catholic community in particular can help address the climate crisis, especially at the level of public policy. I'm going to be moderating today's conversation. As we begin, let's take a moment of silence, and I will read a prayer that is the prayer of stewardship from Catholic Relief Services, one of our partners. And so we pray, God of all creation, at the beginning of time, you placed a single mandate on humankind, to be stewards of creation, to replenish and nurture all generations, what you have made. We kneel today amid that same creation, a world that is, in many ways, more splendid than ever, but in too many ways, scarred beyond recognition. Turn us from our unmindfulness. Help be our light. Help us renew the worlds that support us, so we may once more know creation as it was in the beginning. Amen. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This video is being recorded, and we'll be sending a link to the recording to you within the next couple of days. There'll be time for questions at the end after Ed Maibach's presentation, and you may want to submit your questions by writing them in the question box on the right side of panel on your screen. You may wish to indicate who the question is directed to, either myself or to Ed Maibach, when you submit that question. If you do have audio issues, it's most likely due to your Wi-Fi connection. So you can try to connect by phone for better audio. So GoToWebinar gives you that option to switch to phone. Just click on the audio tab in the right-hand box, and it will give you directions for using your phone for audio. So with that, let's begin. Let me introduce Ed Maibach. So Dr. Edward Maibach is a professor at George Mason University in Northern Virginia and director of Mason's Center for Climate Change Communication. Ed's research focuses on public engagement in climate change. Ed co-chaired the Engagement and Communication Working Group for the third National Climate Assessment. Ed earned his PhD in Communication Science at Stanford University and his Master of Public Health at San Diego State University, and has previously served as Associate Director of the National Cancer Institute, Worldwide Director of Social Marketing at Porto Novelli, and Chairman of the Board for KidSave International. So I was privileged to see a version of this presentation in Toronto last November as part of the Parliament of World Religions. I found it helpful, hopeful, and challenging. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Ed. And Ed, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Before we start, can I actually make sure that you are seeing my my screen?
I am seeing your screen.
Beautiful. Okay. So thank you. Thank you for the prayer. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here and share my thoughts with you and your colleagues and associates. I guess I want to start by saying that, while I am a communication scientist and I bring all of the rigors of my science to the table today, there's really nothing magical about what I'm about to present. And as much of what I'm about to share with you, I think are ideas you've probably already had yourself. Maybe you are already putting into play yourself. But there is one angle that I sort of one opportunity that I hope to reveal to you that you probably haven't thought of. So if much of what I say is a refresher, that's good. It means we're all on the same page. And if the new angle that I hope to share strikes you as appropriate, that's even better. Before I dig into sort of sharing my thoughts about how best to project your concerns about the climate and your reflections on what that means to you as a person of faith, I do want to start at the 60,000 foot level. And my own meditations about the three most important things that we collectively need to accomplish in our own communities, in our own state, in our nation, and worldwide, so the nations of the world together, if we are in fact to successfully address the climate crisis. This is an issue I've spent a lot of time thinking about because I recognize that there are limits to the impact of communication, and the only possible positive impact of if there is to be a positive impact of communication, it must be so that we make things happen in the world that will actually maximize the odds of our averting climate disruption or a climate catastrophe. These three things, these three bullet points on my screen, are what I've decided are really the best way to think about the things that must happen, both locally, in our own communities, in our own lives, as well as worldwide. And the reason why I picked three is simply because there is something magical about the number three in the world of communication. The human brain deals well with items listed in threes. We're all capable of keeping three things in mind. And it's really important for us to have a clear sense of the end point. What is it we're pulling for? So this is my take on it. I've run this past my dear friends, Catherine Hayhoe and Michael Mann, who are two of my climate scientist colleagues and mentors and friends. They're both completely comfortable with these as the three most important things that we as humankind need to accomplish over the next decades or so. Simply producing, moving our entire global energy economy to a clean energy economy. We need to get to or as close to 100% clean energy as possible. There's a role for that, for communities, for nations, for states, for nations, and for the world. But there's also a role for that for you and I. Each one of us can play a role in moving towards 100% clean energy. The second objective is what I call drawdown, building on Paul Hawken's book of the same name, Drawdown, which the idea is pretty darn simple. We need to not only stop putting heat trapping pollution into the atmosphere, but we've already put so much up there. We need to start in a really significant way. We need to start capturing that CO2, harvesting it, and either putting it back in the ground where it belongs, or turning it into solid material that can be turned into useful product, like the bicycle frame that I so covet. And then finally, we need to increase the resilience of every one of our communities. And by communities, I don't mean in the sense of a faith community, I mean our geographic community, the place we live. Wherever we live, we are at greater and greater risk in a variety of ways because of our changing climate. And if we plan to if we wish to protect ourselves and our loved ones and our neighbors, we absolutely have to make some major strides in terms of enhancing the resilience of our community. So those are the three 60,000 foot objectives that I keep my eyes on. We can discuss those at the end, but everything I say from here on out is going to be sort of premised with that as my framework. I'm sorry, I made a change to my presentation this morning and I startled myself with my own next slide. So just yesterday, my colleagues at Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and my team here at George Mason, we released a report called Energy in the American Mind. It's just the latest in a very long series of polling reports. The reason why I decided to slip this one in is not so much to plug this report, but it's available to you on my center's website and on the Yale website, but to make the point that certainly that first objective that I talked about, making the transition to a clean, renewable energy economy, we already have the public, almost all members of the public see that as a good idea already, regardless of their beliefs about climate change. So I'll just show you one table, not from that report, but actually from a similar report produced last spring. You can see some numbers and a bar chart on this slide, which simply I put up to make the point that at least the American people, and I would contend it's almost certainly the case for people around the world, we already think that a clean energy future is a better future. We would much rather power our homes and our businesses and our communities with wind, solar, and geothermal than with oil, gas, and nuclear. Certainly oil and gas, no question about it. People understand that that fossil fuels are dirty energy sources. Burning dirty energy sources to create electricity dirties our air and our water, and that's bad for our health. That understanding is widely held and deeply held among Americans across the political spectrum. So when I talk about making the transition to 100% clean energy, it's a transition that most Americans are already anticipating and looking forward to. So we have the wind at our back, and that's a really important thing. Now let me switch to talking about my understanding of how to use communication to achieve the important societal objectives. And in this case, I've offered you three, but almost regardless of what important objectives we want to achieve, communication can be a powerful asset to us. As Dan indicated, I am a public health professional by training. I've had many decades of experience using communication to address public health goals, to advance public health goals. And in every public health campaign that I have worked on that has been successful, in every successful communication campaign of any type that I'm aware of, whether that's a political campaign, a public health campaign, a public service campaign, or even a commercial campaign, successful campaigns always feature simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. I like to say that those 11 words, simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources, is the most evidence-based communication recommendation in human history. There is so much social science, empirical social science research to support each of those three components in that statement. We know exactly why simple, clear messages work more effectively than complicated messages. We know exactly why message repetition is absolutely crucial to the success of communication, and we know exactly why it must come from trusted voices, because people don't accept information from people that they do not trust. So none of these three components are optional. If we're going to use communication to our advantage to achieve the important objectives that we've laid out for ourselves, we must have simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of our trusted voices. And in the case of your trusted voices as members of the faith community. There's something else that I, as a communications scientist, know, and that is that successful campaigns frame issues in a manner that suggests what the solutions are and motivates people to want to embrace those solutions. So the way issues are framed, it is incredibly important. And often we need to reframe issues if we want to move the public and policymakers and other decision makers past their current position, if their current position is in fact not moving us towards solutions. So the question is, what kind of an issue is global warming? How is it currently framed in the minds of Americans? We know a lot about it. Most Americans see climate change framed as a environmental issue, a plants, penguins, and polar bears issue. And it's not surprising why that is the case. We've been seeing images that have now become iconic, particularly of polar bears and the impact of climate change on polar bears. So the fact that most Americans are most likely to see climate change as an environmental issue is not an accident. It's the product of the way that this issue has been reported, largely in the media over the past couple of decades. But climate change is also seen as a scientific issue. Not improperly so. It is a scientific issue. This happens to be Steve Schneider, from now deceased, formerly from Stanford University, and a world-changing climate scientist, a great guy. But when people see the issue through the lens of science, it tends to be fairly depersonalizing and distancing for them, because most people, certainly most Americans, we really don't see ourselves as being all that involved in science. So when we see an issue through the frame of scientists, it sort of puts us outside the frame, if you will. The third frame that is all too common among Americans is that climate change is seen as a political issue. I used to have a picture of Al Gore when I showed this frame, but I've replaced him with Barack Obama, although I would still contend, and our research suggests that most Americans who choose not to believe that our climate is changing do see Al Gore when they think of the issue, and that's because they're looking at it through a political frame, and they're specifically seeing it as an issue that represents politics they object to. As a public health professional, I've been putting a lot of my emphasis on trying to introduce Americans to the fact that they should be seeing climate change as a human health issue, a threat to the health of our children, the health of our parents, the health of ourselves, and specifically that we should be seeing it as climate solutions as a real health opportunity. I'm happy to say that an increasing number of Americans are beginning to see climate change as through a public health frame, but it's still, most people, when we ask them unprompted to tell us how climate change harms human health, they're still pretty fuzzy on the details. So I would suggest that climate change in a health frame is still very much secondary or tertiary. But now we come to what I believe is probably the main frame that you use to organize your experience of climate change. Climate change is a moral issue. So there's certainly the opportunity for us to introduce the climate change through a moral frame, as a moral issue. And as I said in my introduction, I'm quite sure all of you have given this a lot of thought. This is very likely the dominant frame that you use to organize your experience of the issue. That would make you somewhat unique, however. So what I'm showing you is data from one of our recent surveys, nationally representative surveys. I'm trying to draw your attention where I want you to look through with my red rectangles. Ignore everything over on the center and the right. I just want you to look at the national averages in the vertical bar. So you can see, if you start at the top of the page, you can see just what I've shown you in pictures. That most Americans tell us that global warming is an environmental issue. They say it's a scientific issue, an agricultural issue, an economic issue, a health issue, a lifestyle issue, and a political issue. But many fewer Americans say it's a moral issue. I'm just going to skip national security for a moment, and only 1 out of 4 say it's a social justice or a fairness issue, or a poverty issue. Only 1 out of 10 say it's a spiritual or a religious issue. So this is the data that I offer to you to consider your opportunity to reframe climate change as a moral issue, a social justice, fairness issue, a poverty issue, and the fact that the least of us are being hurt first and worst. All of those have real potential resonance, but they are not common frames in the minds of ordinary Americans today. Our research has shown that there are what we consider to be the 5 key beliefs, or you could even say the 5 key facts that are most important in influencing how people think about global warming, and even more importantly, most important in influencing what people are or are not doing about global warming. People who understand that it's real, that it's us, it's human caused. They understand the extent of the expert consensus, the expert agreement that human caused climate change is happening. They understand that it's bad for people, not just for polar bears, and the extent that they feel that there's hope, that they understand that there are solutions, there are things we can do, actions we can take that will be consequential, that will make a difference. People who hold, the extent to which people hold all 5 of these key beliefs is very strongly associated with the degree to which they support societal solutions. They believe, for example, that America should be doing everything it can to reduce its emission of heat trapping pollution, regardless of what other nations are doing. They support a variety of different proposed policy solutions, and it predicts the extent to which they personally are rolling up their sleeves and getting involved as consumer advocates, encouraging companies to do the right thing, and the extent to which they're getting involved as political advocates, encouraging their elected officials to do the right thing. So these 5 key beliefs are extremely important. We know that from our research. The question is, what is your role? Where do you see yourself fitting in terms of conveying these 5 key beliefs as a member of a faith community, as a person of faith? And I want to focus my thoughts on that going forward. So here's some more data from one of our surveys last year. Essentially what we ask people is, which of the following reasons to reduce global warming, if any, are most important to you? And then we allow people to select up to 3. And then once they've told us up to 3, we ask them, which is the most important to you? So what you see here on the slide are the reasons that Americans tell us is most important to them. The most important reason to reduce global warming. Number 1, most important reason, to provide a better life for our children and grandchildren. For those of us who have children and grandchildren, this is not surprising to any of us. Of course, that is our number 1 reason. Number 2 reason, preventing the destruction of most life on the planet, which is not really stated as a moral issue, but clearly has moral connotations to it. And then the 3rd most common reason is to protect God's creation. I would contend that all 3 of those have a real clear moral element to them. And as people of faith, you can talk about all 3 of those major motivations. The top 3 motivations that Americans have for reducing global warming, you can make all of those, reframe all of those through a moral frame. This piece of research is something that I reread last fall after I had been invited to speak at the Parliament of the World's Religions, where Dan had heard this talk for the first time. I read it for the first time when it was published in 2015, and I completely missed why this is such an important piece of research. It's such an important piece of research in my mind because it was conducted in 24 countries around the planet, at least one country from every inhabited continent on the planet, and because of what it taught us is common to people around the world. So what the researchers did is they asked people first to essentially answer a question that revealed their beliefs about the reality and the importance of climate change. And then they asked the research participants to take a moment and imagine what their nation will be like in the future if their nation takes actions aimed at limiting climate change. So it was an envisioning exercise, if you will. Take a moment and imagine what our nation will be like in the future if we do the right thing and take actions towards limiting climate change. And then all of the participants were asked a variety of questions to describe what they see as the future of what that future nation, their future nation, looks like. And what they found is that there were three factors that I'm sorry, I missed one important point. They also asked people, to what degree are you personally engaged in a variety of citizen actions, a variety of individual behavior changes that will reduce your carbon footprint, and to what degree are you actually making financial donations to organizations working on climate change? And they also ask about future intention to do all of those three things. So in terms of predicting people's intention to engage as a citizen, as a consumer, and as a supporter of civic organizations, there were three sets of beliefs that were most strongly associated. The first one is not surprising, simply the perceived importance of climate change. It's the second two beliefs that are, in my view, very surprising and very important for people, for members of faith communities who want to engage in this issue as a member of a faith community and engaging through a moral frame. Because people who believe that their country will become essentially more developed, a more developed nation as a result of taking climate action. That's both economic development, educational development, scientific development, and the development of sort of civil society. Those people were people who saw those as outcomes of climate action were more likely to say they are personally going to take climate action as citizens, as individuals, and through supporting civic organizations. But it's this final one. It's this final one that I think has the most clear implications for you. People who said that their people, not their nation, but their nation's people, will become more moral and ethical, will become more caring and considerate, will become more trustworthy and honest, will become more sincere and warm if we as a nation address climate change. That is a remarkable finding, in my opinion. The fact that we not only see addressing climate change as strengthening our nation, helping to develop our nation to develop, but we see it as helping our people to develop as moral beings. To me, that is remarkable. And that is what I missed the first time I read this paper in 2015. But I'm glad I found more recently, before I went to Toronto to meet with Dan and others at the Parliament of the World's Religions. So this is what those 24 investigators concluded. They essentially concluded that framing climate action as transforming society for the better is effective at motivating people, even people who aren't convinced that our climate is changing. I didn't really go into that aspect of their research, but what they found is that even people who don't believe in human-caused climate change, they still thought good things would happen to their nation and to their kinsmen, their fellow countrymen, if their nation did the types of things that are essentially climate solutions. So the words at the bottom of the slide are their exact words. Communicating these benefits could motivate action on climate change where traditional approaches have stalled. So this is the question I put to you. What issue frame and what simple, clear messages can you be using your trusted voices to convey? It's a rhetorical question, obviously, because I'm about to suggest my answer to the question. I think that you want to, this dual notion of we not only have a moral obligation to respond to the climate crisis, we actually have a moral opportunity. So not only, if we do the right thing, we are not only helping to avoid catastrophe, but in the process, we are also helping to create a better world and better people. So it's not just our moral obligation, but this really is our moral opportunity. And although I haven't developed messages for you, sort of the gist of it is this is at least how I see it, that the sooner we fully embrace our nation's clean energy destiny and our nation's and we improve our nation's agricultural and land use practices, the sooner we will all have cleaner air and water, better health, and greater economic prosperity. which is wonderful for all of us, but is especially important for the least of us, because the least of us are those who are being hurt first and worst by our changing climate. And what's really important is we can do this. We already have the tools. We do not have to pray for a technological miracle. We have everything we need already to do this. And by using those tools, we will be creating better health and more sustainable wealth for all. And one could absolutely say the most important benefit of doing this is that all of us will become better, more moral people. So I'm going to close with this slide. This is sort of my summary of what I've already said. I do believe that as a person of faith and as speaking as a member of a faith community, you have an enormously trusted voice among members of your community, and I encourage you to use it. And moreover, I encourage you to use it as a member of a faith community, not as a wannabe climate scientist. I actually had the opportunity to be trained by Al Gore 11 years ago, 12 years ago now, to give his quote unquote slideshow. And from the first time I gave that slideshow, I immediately felt like a poser, an Al Gore wannabe. And that is not who, by that point, I already had several decades of experience as a trusted public health professional. So the first time I gave that presentation, I realized that's not the presentation I'm supposed to be giving. I am Ed Maibach, public health professional. I'm supposed to be using my trusted voice as a public health professional. I'm encouraging you to use your trusted voice as a person of faith. What do I want you to share with people? I think it's helpful that you reaffirm that climate change is real, that it's human caused, and the experts virtually all are convinced based on the evidence that human-caused climate change is happening. I just want you to reaffirm that. I don't want you to spend time on that because that's not your area of expertise. You may know about the data behind those things, but that would be a bit of a distraction. I think it's much better for you to go to the next point, the fact that, look, this is bad for us in many ways. It's harming our weather, it's harming our health, it's harming our food, it's undermining our economy. It's bad for our children and grandchildren, and it's especially bad for people who are less privileged than our children and grandchildren. But there are actions we can take. The horse has not irretrievably left the barn on this one. We can rise to this challenge of the climate crisis, and doing so is our moral obligation, but it's also perhaps our greatest moral opportunity to create better people and a better world, because the things we need to do will benefit everyone, especially the least of us. I won't go through the three most important things again, and you may or may not agree with me on those being the three most important, but I do choose to spend my time sharing those as what I see as our global objectives. So in closing, to prevent climate catastrophe, we really need to make this happen right now. Climate scientists have essentially said we have about a decade to make enormous progress on all three of these objectives. But the sooner that we get started, the sooner we all benefit, because the sooner we will create a healthier, more prosperous, more just community and world. So I will turn it back over to you, Dan. And if I can do that and still leave my slides up, or would you like me to take my slides down and you would put some other slides up?
No, why don't you, I was going to say, why don't you leave them up for now, but Paz is our coordinator today. Just if we need to refer back to them, but that's okay. So we have time for, lots of time, frankly, about 25 minutes or so for questions. And there's one question here, and I'm not sure to exactly this is posed, but from Brenda. She says, how and with what specific organizations do you partner with to make the greatest political and individual changes? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. I can talk certainly about the covenant, but go ahead.
Sure. And my organization, we do partner with a large number of organizations, but our partners tend to be essentially communication organizations. So I partner with the Society for Environmental Journalists and then the National Association of Black Journalists, National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and others. But I think the more important question is, who can you partner with? And I think every one of you can partner, for example, with Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a wonderful organization which deals head on with the fact that we're not likely to get climate legislation through the US Congress if we don't have both Republicans and Democrats supporting it. And so Citizens Climate Lobby is totally nonpartisan, and they really put they have a very disciplined methodology for making sure this is an issue that both Republicans as well as Democrats embrace, and I think there's a real wisdom to that approach.
Yeah, and they do have the Citizens Climate Lobby was the impetus behind the bill that has been introduced, was introduced last Congress and is introduced in this Congress, which is the kind of the fee and dividend approach, where we tax carbon emissions at the source, and then that revenue is given back to citizens. So the Bishops' Conference has actually come out in favor of that legislation as well. So that's something that people can pay attention to. And in terms of the Catholic community, I mean, most of you who are on the call know of the Covenant. I mean, we have 18 national Catholic partners, from the Bishops' Conference to Catholic Rural Life to women and men religious communities, and on down the list. We work with them in ways that, to try to help them figure out ways in which they can address the climate issue from the perspective of their organizations. So we do that as well. If you do have a question, the best way to do this, because there are almost over 155 people on the call, the best way to ask a question is to tap on the questions tab on the right side of your screen and type in your question there. So the next question is, could Catholic Climate Covenant come up with daily Instagram and Facebook posts for us to share, to keep putting out to our social networks the simple, clear messages you recommend? And the answer to that is, of course. We already have a Facebook page. I believe we have an Instagram page. We also have a Twitter feed, so you can find all of those. And we can certainly take Ed's advice and try to shape some of those messages a little bit more crisply and with a lot more repetitiveness, I think, as well. The next question is, how can we best get our pastors to support our efforts? Their support can really help us. Ed, do you want to take a crack at that, or would you?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm going to reinterpret the question as, if you are not the sort of the person of greatest influence, how can you get to the person of greatest influence? In this case, I guess the question is, how can I get my pastor to use his or her trusted voice in this way? And I would say, make the ask, like, sit down, make an appointment, sit down and talk to him or her, and really walk him or her through why you have realized that this is a moral issue. This is the greatest moral challenge, moral obligation of our time. But also talk about the moral opportunity, the fact that if the extent to which we can rise to this occasion, we are going to be improving ourselves. We're going to be better people as a result. And all you can do is make your best shot at it. Use your trusted voice with your pastor, and possibly bring other fellow congregants with you, so that it's not just you. Strength in numbers always is an evolutionary principle as well as a social principle. And then, of course, you got to work with message repetition. If the pastor isn't open to it the first time through, keep coming back. Bring other people back. Bring his or her most trusted confidants back with you. Ultimately, as a communication scientist, I've become convinced that our target audience is often much smaller than we appreciate. That it's often just one or two people. And in the case of getting climate legislation through the U.S. Congress, it's probably going to come down to a small handful of members of Congress, and each of those small handful of members of Congress have a relatively small handful of people they trust the most. So if you can get to the people who your pastor trusts the most, or if you can get to who your member of Congress trusts the most, those really are your greatest assets to become a persuasive communicator.
Yeah, and I'll add, we do have a creation care team program. Many of you are probably already members of that, but it's really a wonderful program where we have a number of toolkits to help you form that creation care team in your parish, and which includes how to persuade your pastor, how to engage more people in your parish, the types of activities that you might want to do to create that creation care team. Let's face it, our pastors are very, very busy people for the most part. Some of them are actually, working with 2 or 3 parishes. So they're not going to be able to do this on their own, and they will need us to both convince them of the importance of it, but also allow us to work in the parish to do some simple things, starting with some recycling or getting rid of styrofoam at our parish halls and so forth, to more complicated things like, can we tighten up the building, the parish building, the school, if we have a school attached to our building. Catholic Climate Covenant has a program for that too. It's called Catholic Energy. So there's a number of things that you can do to try to convince your pastor. The best things are make it easy for him, so that he doesn't have to do a lot of work, and make it very practical as well, so that he can see the benefits of doing some of these things. The next question is, can you simply explain 350 parts per million as a target for reduction of emissions? And then the second part of that question, will you review the slide that demonstrated the Republican-Democrat response to climate change?
Sure. So
Paz will get back to that slide for us.
Yeah, thank you. 350 is actually not the right target. I chose that. I put that number and used that number somewhat reluctantly because the number 350 is pretty well out there in the climate advocacy community as a result of the efforts of 350.org. In reality, the level at which the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere certainly over the time in which human civilization emerged and has thrived, has been more like 280. So 350 parts per million is too much. That's already the product of the industrialization of our world. So I actually feel the most defensible level would be 280. But as a communication scientist who believes deeply in the value of repetition, I've decided to hitch this particular wagon to 350.org because they've done a heck of a job in certainly engaging people around the world in the awareness that anything above 350 is just too much. And then, Paz, if you could go back to that slide that showed at the beginning of my presentation that showed the support for clean energy sources. Thank you. I'm not sure what you wanted to see there, but we'll just leave that up on the screen while we take the next question.
Well, is there more you want to say about this slide, or maybe the questioner, it's Mary? Oh no, I'm sorry, it's Arlene. If there's something more specific you want, let me see if
yeah, well, happy to point. Well, Arlene answers if there was something more specific she wanted. I'll make one point about this slide.
Sure.
So
yeah.
I use this slide to show the fact that, for example, just look at support. People who say they support, well, the question is, in the future, do you think the United States should use the following energy sources less, more, or about the same as we do today? And then we allow people to, if they say less, we allow them to say much less or somewhat less. And if they say more, we allow them to say much more or somewhat more. So you can see that 8 out of 10 Americans say we should be using solar somewhat more or much more. And while it is true that Democrats are more likely to say that, 84% of Democrats say much more or somewhat more. It's also true that 75% of Republicans do. So while Democrats and Republicans may be living in different worlds with regard to their views of global warming, they are not living in different worlds with regard to their views of clean energy and the fact that this is our future. It's a better future, and it's because both liberals and conservatives understand it's a healthier future for their child and for their father-in-law, who has chronic obstructive lung disease and spends a good portion of his day, using an oxygen tank. So it isn't really surprising that liberals and conservatives alike feel that a clean energy future is a better future.
Great, thank you. Let's see, the website for Citizens Climate Lobby I've posted, it's, hang on just a second, it's citizensclimatelobby.org, just as you would expect. There's another question here. It says, in the South, we struggle with climate change skepticism. How do you suggest that we get beyond the political divisions of climate change to have a genuine dialogue on the issue?
Yeah. So my colleagues at the Yale program on climate change communication, led by Anthony Leisowitz, they have created this amazing tool called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. And you can see it. It's online. So just Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps, and it will allow you to see exactly what members of your geographic community think, feel, and would like to see done about climate change. And the reason why I would encourage you to look at the map of your county, of public opinion in your county or in your municipal area or even in your congressional district, which don't often align perfectly, is because you might be surprised that even in the deep South and across the Southeast, climate skepticism is never the norm. It feels like the norm because climate skeptics are the most vocal, are the loudest voices in our national media, certainly in our conservative national media, and they are often the most vocal voices in our own community. But if you actually look at the survey data, you'll see that those people their views are outside the norm. The normative view is one of concern. Right now, 7 out of 10 Americans answer our survey questions and indicate that they are worried about climate change. And I don't care where you live in the South or the West or the North or the Mid-Atlantic. I can promise you that the most common point of view is one of concern about climate change. And so if that doesn't create a basis for a dialogue, I don't know what does. We cannot allow ourselves to be silenced because there are a couple of noisy people in our community who are either willfully ignorant or are just genuinely ignorant on this issue. We absolutely have to focus on the majority of members of our community who are worried about the issue but never have the opportunity to talk about it, never have the opportunity to learn about it. When we ask people how frequently do you hear about this issue in the media, on average, people tell us they hear about it less than once a month in the media, which is really hard for me to believe because I live so deep inside the climate change bubble. I probably read 20 media accounts in a day, but what people tell us is that they're just not hearing about it or seeing it in their local media. So I would encourage you to think of the actions that you can take to start a climate conversation in your community as doing a favor for the majority of your neighbors who don't ever have an opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you, Ed. Next question, and unfortunately we're not going to get to all of them, so just bear with me. Can you talk about what and how a carbon tax works?
Sure, I can. And there are a whole variety of ways in which a carbon tax can work. There are places in the world that have a carbon tax. For example, several Canadian provinces, I believe several Canadian provinces. I know for a fact that British Columbia has had a carbon tax for almost a decade now. And the idea is pretty simple, that you essentially charge producers of carbon fuels a tax on the fuels that they have extracted and processed. It does mean that in all likelihood, it means the consumer will be paying more on the other end of the production and consumption continuum. So the essentially you're raising the price to a level that is commensurate with the damage that the fossil fuels are the damage that they are causing in our world. The exact dollar figure of that damage is very much debated right now. I've heard extremely conservative Republican economists who say that just the public health damages alone from a ton of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere is a minimum of $15 to $20, suggesting that even if you took climate change out of the equation and you only had a carbon tax to account for the public health costs, or what economists called externalities of using fossil fuel, it would be $15 to $20 a ton. Most economists suggest that the best way to use a carbon tax is to set it initially at a relatively low level, perhaps less than the actual damages caused by the emission of the CO2, but to set it to essentially set it in place such that it will increase every single year at a fixed level to send a very clear signal to the marketplace, so that essentially companies will know exactly how much more expensive their fossil fuel will be in each year going forward. And in doing so, the idea is pretty simple, that because the producers of clean energy, and whether or not you include nuclear in that decision is a debate that lots of people have. We won't go into it today. But any energy that is not producing and emitting CO2, of course, doesn't have to pay that carbon tax. So it's a way to level the playing field so that the energies that aren't harming us become more competitive in the marketplace, and the energies that are the energy forms that are harming us become less competitive in the marketplace. And it allows the invisible hand of the market, to use the words of Adam Smith, to do what it does so well. And it doesn't pick winners and losers in terms of energy source. It simply prices the fuel appropriately by putting the full cost of the fuel not only at the gas pump or not only at your electrical meter, but the real full cost of it to society, including the damages that it inflicts on our health and on our climate.
Great. Another question, public policy question. So the question is, the Green New Deal seems to articulate that moral obligation and moral opportunity, but its very title and its major proponents are challenging for lots of people. How can we best repackage those principles in a way that can engage more people when it comes to advancing legislation that accomplishes those goals?
That is such a good question, and I really encourage you to come to my website and download that the Energy in the American Mind report that we released yesterday, because we ask about first of all, we ask about public awareness of the Green New Deal, and when we conducted this survey in December, only 15% of the public said that they'd ever heard of it, and fewer than 5% said they really knew anything about it. But then we went on to describe in simple, clear terms what we saw as the key elements of the Green New Deal. And we asked people, to what degree do you support or oppose this proposition? And what we learned was remarkable. 81% of voters said they support the proposition underlying the Green New Deal, including, I believe it is 57% of conservative Republicans said they support it. Now, mind you, this was before the Republican Congress and the Republican president started attacking it. So we knew that support for the proposition would decrease. But because we were able to ask people how the idea felt to them. Does this seem like a good idea or a bad idea? And we learned that it actually seems like a good idea to the majority of conservative Republicans and an overwhelming majority of Democrats and independents. We think there's something there. And as you said, we think this is an idea, if it can be depoliticized, taken out of sort of being seen as the product of the Democratic Party, and instead be seen as the product of Americans who care about their environment, care about their health, care about the health of their loved ones, and care about the future of all human civilization, I'd say it stands a fighting chance for passage. I don't know that it will pass in the way it is being proposed, but the basic idea is one of investing in renewal for our economy, for our health, and for our climate. And I think that notion of investing for renewal is one that is resonant across the political spectrum.
Thanks, Ed. What books would you recommend to us to help us gain more information regarding this issue?
Oh, wow, that is such a great. I guess I'm going to recommend a book that has just been published by David Wallace Wells. He's I think he's the associate editor of New York Magazine. I've had the opportunity to get to know him over the past couple of years. He's talked to climate scientists and interviewed them, a whole range of them, and he's interested in the question of what's the worst that could happen, because climate scientists don't often talk about that. And so he lays out for his readers a broader sense of the possibilities of really how bad this could get. But then he does something else with the book, which I think is incredibly useful. And what he does is essentially he makes the case that every little bit that we can do to prevent that worst case scenario is a huge contribution to humankind. So the difference between 1.5 degrees of global warming and 2 degrees is really significant. And the IPCC last fall released a report called the 1.5 degree special report or something like that, which, because the global goal right now is to hold the warming to 2 degrees, and the IPCC wanted to make clear just how much better off we will be if we can hold the warming to 1.5 degrees. But David, in his book, he also makes clear that the same is true of 2.5 versus 3 degrees, or 3 versus 3.5 degrees. So he's making a very helpful argument, which is everything we do will help. Everything that we do that will get us to these three objectives that I've talked about in terms of accelerating the transition to a clean energy economy, in terms of drawing down heat trapping pollution out of our atmosphere and putting it back in the ground where it belongs, and in terms of increasing the resilience of our community so that people and other living things aren't needlessly hurt. All of those things will make a difference. And so while his book is incredibly alarming and frightening, it's also incredibly heartening, because it really helps us understand that every little bit that we can accomplish will help somebody. In fact, will help millions of people.
We have just a minute or two left, and I'm skipping around on some of the questions. And again, I apologize for those whose questions weren't asked, but I'm going to just go ahead and ask this last one. It'd be a nice way for you to summarize your presentation, Ed. The question is this: is the title of your presentation hyperbole, or do you genuinely believe that the faith community holds the key to climate action? What light does research shine on who trusted messengers are, and where do faith leaders fall on that list?
Well, I would point out that I didn't actually write that, Dan. Those are probably your words. But I'm going to answer the question anyway. I actually do believe the faith community holds a key, not the key, but a key. When I talked at the beginning of my presentation about the different frames, yes, the political community holds a key, and yes, the climate science community holds a key, and me and my colleagues in the public health community and the healthcare community, we hold a key, but none of us hold the key that you hold. You hold a unique key. You have a unique reason for caring. You have a unique community of people you can engage with that none of the rest of us are nearly as trusted with. So I don't think your key is going to get the job done. It's not a sufficient key, but it's a necessary key. And the sooner you start using that key, the sooner all of our keys together will unlock the solution to a better future.
Thanks, Ed. A lot of people are asking for the title of that book again. Is it The Uninhabitable Earth? Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes, it is.
David Wallace Wells. So it's
It,
The Uninhabitable Earth: Life After Warming by David Wallace Wells. That's the book. I sent a link. I believe I sent a link to it on Amazon.
and I
Ed,
know we're out
thank you.
of time.
Go
Can I
ahead.
just one more statement really quick?
Mhm.
Another book that's much more heartening, frankly, and I think I'm confident every one of you will really enjoy reading and owning, is Paul Hawken's book Drawdown, which, as you know, was the second point that I'm recommending: how to take heat trapping pollution out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground where it belongs. It is the most inspiring book that I think I've read in the past year.
I would definitely agree with that. It's a can-do book. And I think it is very inspiring that we can, there are lots of ways to tackle this, and he lists all of them, I think. Well, Ed, thank you so much. This has been truly enlightening. And again, I apologize to those who asked questions and we weren't able to get to them. I will, if you have questions that you just desperately want answered, just email us. You can email either the info@catholicclimatecovenant.org, or you can email me directly, Dan Misla at catholicclimatecovenant.org. This is the end of our webinar. It will be recorded, and it has been recorded rather, and we'll post that in a couple of days on our website and send all of you that link so that there's no mystery about it. Again, Ed, thank you so much. Thanks everybody, and have a blessed day.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. I think we're off. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.